There is a moment when people stop explaining themselves, and it rarely feels dramatic at first. It happens quietly in conversations that used to feel normal. Proverbs records the threshold without emotion. Do not answer a fool according to his folly. That line sounds like wisdom until it becomes behavior. Explanation ends when every sentence feels like a liability. Psalm 39 captures the internal decision plainly. I will be silent and not open my mouth. That silence is not peace, it is containment. It appears when speaking no longer produces understanding, only resistance. People do not stop explaining because they have nothing to say. They stop because explanation stops working. There is a moment that happens quietly, and most people miss it while it is forming. Someone stops explaining themselves in places where they used to clarify everything. Their words become shorter, then fewer, then optional. Explanation ends when engagement begins to feel unsafe. Psalm 39 records the decision again without comfort. I will be silent and not open my mouth. This silence is not calm, it is restraint under pressure. People assume disengagement starts with conflict, but Scripture shows it starts after repeated attempts to reason. Proverbs adds pressure to the pattern. Do not rebuke mockers, or they will hate you. The cost of correction becomes social damage. Engagement turns into exposure. Job voices the exhaustion underneath it when he asks, "Why should I explain myself to you?" That question does not seek an answer. It signals a withdrawal of effort. At this stage, nothing has collapsed yet. Relationships still exist. Rooms are still entered. Conversations still start. But explanation has been quietly removed from the exchange. This moment does not belong to one personality or one era. It repeats wherever explanation meets resistance long enough to become pointless. The Bible records individuals who did not argue louder or demand to be understood. They reduced effort instead. Words were not taken away from them, they were withheld. Over time, explanation becomes something given only when it is safe. When safety disappears, explanation disappears with it. This pattern shows up before separation, before isolation, and before visible collapse. Silence here is not absence, it is selection. Speech becomes filtered, engagement becomes conditional. The Bible does not interrupt this process or correct it, it observes it. Once explanation is withdrawn, interaction changes shape, even if the setting stays the same. Conversations continue, but depth does not. Presence remains, but participation weakens. Outsiders rarely notice the shift because nothing dramatic happens. No exit is announced, no boundary is declared, but the person who stopped explaining has already moved internally. Scripture treats this shift with an unsettling neutrality. It does not rush in to fix it. It records the behavior and moves on. Proverbs states, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly," not as encouragement, but as boundary recognition. The verse does not praise silence, it marks the moment when engagement becomes unsafe. In the Gospels, Jesus is questioned repeatedly and then stops responding. Luke records that he gave no answer, without explanation or defense. The Bible does not frame this as victory, it presents it as a turning point. When explanation is removed, authority changes shape. Power shifts to the one who no longer needs to be understood. Psalm 39 returns as a quiet echo. I will be silent and not open my mouth, showing restraint as a response to pressure rather than peace. Scripture places these moments side by side across different lives and eras, suggesting a shared pattern rather than isolated choice. Once explanation stops, accountability weakens. Misunderstanding is allowed to stand. The relationship does not end, but clarity does. The Bible does not resolve what follows. It simply shows that after this point, outcomes accelerate. Distance increases without announcement. Separation forms without argument.
Those watching from the outside often mistake the quiet for agreement. They do not realize explanation has already been withdrawn. Once explanation is gone, behavior begins to reorganize itself. People speak less, but they also listen differently. They stop checking for understanding. They stop correcting assumptions. Misinterpretation becomes tolerated because correction feels costly. This is where silence hardens into distance without anyone naming it. The person still shows up, but they arrive guarded. Responses become careful. Words are chosen to avoid friction rather than create clarity. Proverbs warns that rebuke can turn into hatred, and that warning explains the adjustment. When engagement produces loss, disengagement feels rational. Over time, this reshapes identity. The person who stopped explaining no longer expects to be known. They begin to function as if misunderstanding is permanent. This changes how trust operates. Trust no longer means being understood. It means not being exposed. The Bible shows that this stage does not look like rebellion. It looks like restraint. But restraint carries weight. With each withheld explanation, connection thins. With each unchallenged assumption, distance grows. Nothing has ended yet. No one has left. But the conditions for separation are now quietly in place. At this stage, the shift becomes visible to others, though few understand what they are seeing. The person is still present, but something is missing from the exchange. They answer questions, but they do not volunteer clarity. They respond, but they do not explain. This is where silence begins to look like agreement from the outside. When explanation disappears, assumptions fill the space. Others project meaning onto the quiet. Intentions are guessed, motives are assigned. The person who stopped explaining often allows this to happen because correcting it would require re-entering the same cycle that caused withdrawal. Over time, this creates an imbalance. One side feels understood without effort. The other side feels unseen without protest. Distance grows faster now. Decisions are made without consultation. The quiet person is still counted as present, but their influence fades. This is not isolation yet. It is participation without impact. Once a person reaches this stage, reversal becomes rare. Explanation would require admitting how far the withdrawal has already gone. By the time this stage is reached, the change feels settled rather than sudden. The person who stopped explaining has adjusted their expectations downward. They no longer anticipate understanding, they anticipate endurance. Scripture shows this moment without relief or instruction. It records that speech has been weighed and found too costly. Silence now functions as protection, but protection comes with a trade. Connection requires exposure, and exposure has already proven unsafe. Presence is maintained without investment. Scripture consistently places these moments before separation, not after it. It is the quiet before visible distance. Others often sense something is wrong, but cannot name it. The person is still there. They still respond. Nothing appears broken, yet explanation has been removed from the relationship. Without explanation, repair becomes impossible. This is why Scripture treats silence with gravity rather than praise. It is not a virtue here, it is a signal. Once people stop explaining themselves, they have already begun preparing for life without being understood. What follows does not arrive loudly. It arrives gradually, carried by the quiet decision that speaking is no longer worth the cost. What Scripture never does is show this pattern stopping halfway. It shows what comes next without announcing it. After explanation is withdrawn and silence settles in, distance does not need effort anymore. It grows on its own. People assume separation happens when someone leaves, but the Bible shows separation forming long before that moment. Jesus says, "I will not speak to you again," not as punishment, but as a marker. Something has already ended by the time those words appear. When explanation stops, the relationship changes shape, even if both people remain present. Conversations continue, But meaning does not travel. Decisions are made without shared understanding. Eventually, the silence that once felt protective begins to feel permanent. This is why the Bible records these moments without comfort. It treats them as warnings embedded in behavior. Once people stop explaining themselves, they are no longer negotiating connection. They are preparing for distance. And the unsettling part is this: from the outside, nothing looks finished yet, but inside, the decision has already been made.
There is a moment when people stop explaining themselves, and it rarely feels dramatic at first. It happens quietly,